My connection to Venice goes back to the early 1980s when I came to California to live for good from Minnesota. And back in Minnesota, I went to high school at the inventor of rollerblades. And I was the first sales rep for rollerblades in California. And here around Venice, I lived in a VW van and 72 Cutlass as well in 83 and 84. And in my van, I had 30 pairs of used rollerblades that were demonstration skates. And I traveled all over California, living out of the van, being kind of a Pied Piper. And effectively, I was the first effective sales representative for rollerblades in California to kind of start the trend here. And since then, I ended up living in Santa Monica. I was part of the group that started the Green Party in California. I got elected to the city council in Santa Monica in '96 and in 2000. 2000, I was chosen mayor by the council for a couple of years. I've stayed active in politics, and in particular for something I would like to touch on tonight in terms of the kind of electoral reforms I'm hoping this movement will embrace. The Green Party is in about 100 countries around the world, so I've gotten the experience of seeing how different electoral systems work all over the planet. And it may not be a surprise to you, but our system isn't really the most democratic. We're often raised to believe that it is. And when voting systems in other countries are described, they're often described as a complicated system and a confusing system, as somehow people in Ireland or Australia or Chile are so much smarter than us that they can figure out how to use a different system, but we can't. So as a movement here, when we want to get change, at some point as we try and identify the things that we want, there has to be one foot in this kind of social movement building, but there also has to be some foot in the governing structures and trying to get the policies enacted there and or transforming those structures as well. And it's important, I think, to understand why those structures have excluded our voices and why we end up with the 1% and the 99%. It's not by accident, and a system that really would work would be one where everybody who has a stake in the decision has some voice in what's going to happen, so that all the different interests in society are at the table. All of us are part of something larger than ourselves. We all have little pearls of wisdoms, and good governmental systems are ones that ensure that that diversity of voices are heard and are actually at the table. If we were a government here, this grouping of us here at Occupy Venice, nobody would have a monopoly on good ideas, and we'd end up being stronger if we had a process like you're going through with the General Assembly of trying to hear everybody's voices, try and come to a general direction that incorporates that sort of wisdom. But our U.S. single-member district, winner-take-all voting system means that only one person gets elected for every area. And then to win that seat, you have to get a large percent or a majority of the vote. And to do that, you need often a lot of money because our districts are really large, and you often have to convince people who don't agree with you to elect you, because often there isn't just a single majority around one person or one set of ideas. There might be a bunch of different groups, and eventually you have to get a majority. So it's a lot of money to do that. And then that kind of perpetuates itself. It draws only the people who can afford it, and people try and buy the candidates, and we have this terribly bought system that we have today. So a lot of other countries don't do it that way. Instead of just having one person elected, so like if we were sending some council to a council of occupies all over greater LA, if we only sent one person from here, regardless of what a good process we'd have, they're probably not likely to represent the diversity. But what if we were able to send several people? What if when we had elections, we had multi-seat districts, and the people who got elected were elected proportionally to the percentage of how those views were held in the society? So, like, if you do it by political party, for example, and there's ways you can do it by party, but not by party, but say by political party. I'm in the Green Party. Let's say that 20% of the people agree with the Green Party on whatever issue it is. Being against the death penalty, decommissioning the nuclear power plants in California, or you pick your issue, okay? So, in our current system, if the Green Party candidate gets 20% of the vote, there's no representation. You could get 49% of the vote and get no representation. But in proportional systems of proportional representation, the number of seats are allocated to the percentage of the vote. So let's say the Greens get 20%, the Libertarians get 15%, the Republicans get 30%, the Democrats get 40%, and 5% for the Reform Party. That probably adds, off the top of my head, I think that adds up to 100%. In that sort of system, you've got a lot more diversity of perspective already there. You still have majority rule. You still, when your legislature votes, you still have to get a majority, but now you don't just have two big blobs there, whose primary political motivation in those kind of systems is to bring the other side down. So it's not surprising when we look at what the Republicans, the Republicans in this Tea Party faction movement infection of their party here, they've made them probably throw out all social mores in terms of how government works. But it's still in their interest to try and bring Obama down. And that's what happens in winner-take-all systems. Really, if there's only one other party that arguably is likely to have a chance to win, you just hit them, and you try and suck the air out of the way that they're surviving. So systems that have multi-parties in government, now there's a lot more play back and forth.
Can I ask a question? I know about parliamentary systems where there are multi-parties in that coalition. I'm not aware of this about multi-voices in a particular district, multi-representative.
Sure. So what he's saying is, okay, what is often referred to as parliamentary systems still can be elected by single-seat winner-take-all districts. They are that way in England. But most of the other European countries do it proportionally. So their national parliament comes out of this proportional system, 20% of the seats to this party, that party. Parliamentary systems are ones that the majority of legislators elects the chief executive. In our country, we elect the chief executive separately. So we can have proportional representation for our Congress, we can have it for the legislature. So then his question is, okay, where are there examples of multi-seat districts? In Germany, for example, their system, half of their national parliament is elected in single-seat districts and half of it proportional. They have a whole proportional election for the whole country. So effectively, it's about 650 seats in the Bundestag and half proportionally and half that way. So it's one big district. I'll come back to a plan for California that could have several districts, but at least from the principle, when you look at our system, it isn't designed for a 21st century, super diverse country from people who have come from all over the world, from everywhere on the planet, all sorts of different perspectives. And even though that's a lot of our strength, it has been. I'm an immigrant to this country. I was born in Greece. I was adopted, brought here when I was a baby. Very fortunate that the country, at least at times, is open to immigration. But it's part of our strength is our diversity, but our government doesn't really allow it. So that's one piece, and I want to continue a bit on how we have to change the voting system, including how that can work here in Venice. But along with it, it's important to remember that a lot of the Occupy Wall Street movement is questioning the economic system. And to the degree that we have an economy that's based on unlimited consumption, on a planet with finite resources, when you're doing that, when you're increasing that kind of Darwinian competition for the resources, you inevitably concentrate power in fewer and fewer hands. And as the technology has gotten greater, companies get more able to procure resources and control them. As we're dependent on fossil fuels and other resources of the planet, meaning we have to go further and further to get them, and there's the monopolies around gathering the resources and transporting them, the railroads and how they've developed the politics of California, for example. All of those dynamics, because we're not living sustainably in balance with the culture, means that instead of having distributed generation of power, like a state that would be based on having solar energy, for example, generated from every home, instead we look at controlling, corporate America controlling concentrated sources of power and then doling that out and all the corruption of power that goes with it. So it's both from an ecological sense, because we don't live ecologically, and from a political sense in our winner-take-all system. So both of those, when we start to look at what we want to change, are we going to get that change in the economic system and in the laws that affect the economic system if we don't have a more democratic system? The difficulty that we've had to have any climate change legislation, for example. We can't get anything through the Congress. Instead, we have a lot of these total wingnuts who are denying climate change to start with, and they control the Energy Committee. So are we going to be able to have those sort of changes unless we get the democratic reforms? The play here in California, to answer your question. The state in California, we have 80 people in the Assembly, 40 in the State Senate. That is the worst per capita representation in the United States. We have the worst, which means that we have the fewest number of legislators for the most population of any state. The next worst state is Texas, and they're 3.5 times better than us, and they're 49th. So the last time we dealt with the size of our state legislature was 1879, the last state constitutional convention that we had. So when you start to look at representation in the state, there's two things. There's the number of representatives, and then there's how we elect them proportionally or not. And so let's look at the proportional side. No, let's look at the issue about more politicians. Before even the benefits of the proportional side, one of the arguments that's always thrown back against going to a larger legislature is, oh, you're just going to have more politicians. It's more of them. And why should we pay as taxpayers to have a bigger government with more people making laws, and we don't need all those laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But people are less accountable to the degree that the districts are larger, and it takes more money to elect them, and they're not as close to the people that they represent. They're more likely to act like politicians when the people who can influence them are the people who are lobbyists or who fund their campaigns, that affect how they're going to get in. The speaker, as Willie Brown was for years, and how he doled out money to ensure that people got elected. So if we went to a legislature in California that had a much better per capita ratio of representation, the fact is we might have more people elected to office, but they might act more like citizen representatives than the negative connotation that we have for politicians. The best plan that I've seen for California then is a half and half one, like Germany, where half the seats are elected in single seat districts, but much smaller districts than we have today, and then half of them proportional. I personally favor a fully proportional one, but politically it's probably not going to happen in the state because people are used to having these districts. So how do you get to have more seats? An easy way is to combine both houses of the legislature, to combine the Assembly and the Senate. That way, already, simply if we just did it with the existing number of people, if you had 80 and 40, now you'd go up to 120, and you'd be increasing, the size and lowering the number of people per district. But let's put it to, what if we wanted to equal Texas? So that would mean approximately a 360-person legislature. Okay, so a unicameral legislature. Now, what happens in that with a larger legislature? Currently in the legislature, you've got only 80 and 40. People don't attend committee meetings. They don't get a chance to read all their legislation. They're running around all over the place. But if you had 360 people can specialize. They can go to the committee meetings. They'd have time to be back in their districts more. It would increase the democracy on that side. Then instead of having 80 and 40 districts, you'd have 180 districts. Those would be smaller. For the proportional side, let's get to what you're saying about having districts. The idea that's advanced in this wonderful book called California Crack-Up, which is available through UC Berkeley Press, Joe Matthews and Mark Paul. What they're recommending is taking the 180 seats and dividing it into 8 districts, regions, that would embody the regional nature of California, the economic regions, the land use regions, the regional transportation regions, all of those sort of dynamics. So certainly, the Central Valley is different than all the way in the north. You've got the Bay Area, you've got the greater Los Angeles area, etc. So now, what happens in those districts? Out of those 180 seats, the number of seats per district would be proportional to the number of registered voters there. So the LA district would be 33 seats out of those 180. Now what happens in an election of 33 compared to 33 elections of 1? Now what happens is, what are some of the issues here regionally? What are the transportation corridors? What are we going to do with them? Where are rail lines going to go? What are going to be the affordable housing and affordable housing, open space, issues that go along those corridors? How are the feeder lines? How do you work an entire regional approach? And what sort of tax structures will help those happen that would recoup the publicly created wealth, etc.? All those questions. So now, if you have a regional election, people are campaigning regionally, not just what's best for Venice, but somebody who's talking about what's best for Venice all the way down Venice Boulevard, down to the end and further. And in that way, we're likely to get government that is more reflective of the real reality of what California is today, which is a nation state. California is 35th largest in terms of governmental units and population. The 34 units that are larger than us all have subdivisions, like some level of states or provinces. But We don't. I mean, the counties don't really serve that sort of purpose. Having a proportional system that elected people regionally into the state government, not splitting Northern California and Southern California, it's a benefit for us to be able to have coordination on such a large level, but it isn't as bottom-up and as informed as it should be. So that's where proportional representation can go for the state. I want to touch now on Venice and the kind of reforms that you could be really advocating for here. The city of Los Angeles has 15 large single-seat districts. That's how the city council works. And these districts are effectively about as large as congressional districts in terms of population. Not very democratic. They're enormous. So clearly the size and the money that's needed to reach that many people is a limit on the democracy. It's a limit to who can run, who can get elected in most cases. The League of Women Voters for years has been raising this sort of per capita question, and then ultimately in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had two charter reform commissions in the city of Los Angeles. One was elected, one was appointed, and what went on the ballot were a couple of alternatives. One was to increase the size of the LA Council to 21 seats, one was to increase the size to 25 seats. Both of those were defeated overwhelmingly with the same "we don't want more politicians" sort of dynamic. So what would make... I'm saying, rhetorically, that was the argument people would say. The people were not served by having more politicians. As bad as it is, you're just going to make it worse. That's always the argument that the No campaign played against this sort of thing.
Yeah, but can I jump on this question? I think it's a good question. Who were the lobbying, financing forces behind?
Who was the No campaign?
Yeah.
No, it was a long time ago, and honestly, I don't have that all. I had to go back tonight and look to make sure it was 21 and 25.
Okay.
But given that you spent time in New York, the New York City Council is 51 members, I believe, and the Chicago City Council is 49 members. And here, LA is 15 members. So when you look at what we've got here, a couple things could happen. One, we could have more districts. Two, we could look at the question of how we elect people. So there's a couple ways of doing it. First, let's assume that we just kept the single-seat districts, even we didn't go beyond the 15 that we have today. The current way that we elect people isn't the worst, but it isn't the best. LA does a two-round system. If nobody gets a majority in the first round, when everybody's running, they go to a runoff. But a better system is one where, what if there's 6 candidates and you had a chance to rank them? Not only choose one. Our current system says you can only choose one candidate. So let's say that, I'll give you a practical example. Your current council member, Bill Rosenthal, when he first ran, so he's already in the end of his second term. When he first ran, there was another community member before Bill announced named Sheila Bernard. Do any of you know Sheila here? Okay, Sheila was a primary activist in the Lincoln Place, the fight to retain the affordable housing that was Lincoln Place for a long time. And she helped fight that for years. She's really well informed on affordable housing and tenants' rights. A very, very important issue for this city and this district. So what happened then is she was thinking about running. When Bill got in the race, Bill was more of a heavyweight candidate. It was more likely he was going to run, and Sheila ended up not running. But if there was a system where you could rank the candidate, which is called ranked choice voting, Sheila could have run, and you could have ranked Sheila number 1 and Bill number 2. And Sheila was strong on some issues, Bill wasn't as strong on, and vice versa. The public debate would have been stronger, the people would have been served more, and then if Bill was elected with a strong number of second choices from people who voted first for Sheila, he would know that a big part of the electorate had this very strong priority around certain issues. So the LA system could go in that direction. And if it did, not only would it give more power to voters, but it would save money. If the city council elections, the LA Community College elections, and the LAUSD elections went to this system, there would be $10 million saved every 2 years in conducting elections, because we don't have to go to runoffs. Better for the
you have to spend more tabulating the vote. You have to spend more.
No, there's computer programs that run this stuff, and Ireland and Australia run their elections like this. Now, thus far, there are 6 council members in LA who support this idea. Bill Rosendahl from this district, Jose Huizar, Greg Corian, Eric Garcetti, Paul Koretz, and one more, a little bit down here. No, he's not for it. And Ed Reyes. So there's 6 that are in favor of it. It would be very interesting if the neighborhood councils and the Occupy movement and others were able to get the council to finally take the final step. They've looked at it, they've studied it, they've never put it on the ballot. The 2013 elections in LA, imagine if it was on the ballot and you had the mayoral race and you're asking the mayoral candidates where they were on the issue, etc. There's the 3 current or former council members who are running right now, Garcetti, Wendy Gruhl, and Jan Perry. And the 3 of them, Gruhl is a very strong supporter, Garcetti's into it, and Perry's entirely against it. Why not ask the council to put it on the ballot and then draw these people out and see where they are on this kind of election reform? That would be a fantastic way to start, even within the current system. Down the line, if we could return to constitutional reform, what if we had multi-seat districts? So instead of only one person coming out of a district, what if you had 3 people coming out of a district? And you weren't just required, only one person, one political perspective. Obviously that would mean a larger council. You might have 15 districts of 3, you might have some other mix, but that would allow diversity. Let me go to your question in 1 second, but let me just throw one other piece up. A lot of the difficulty with the Civil Rights Act and trying to draw districts that are fair, to give opportunities to significant portions of our population, the difficulty in drawing districts is if you have a district where a group racially districts itself, where people are concentrated in one area, you can draw a district and have people coming out of that group. But what happens if a group is distributed much more and they aren't concentrated in one place? What if they're distributed over a larger area? Should their representation be penalized because they're not geographically centered? A proportional system with multi-seats in a district gives people a lower threshold to get elected and has a chance to have a more of a proportional representation than single-seat districts. Your question?
Is there any petitions right now at the moment in time out there to make these changes?
Nobody's been gathering petitions because the signature threshold in Los Angeles is very high, and a couple of years ago there was a commitment from one citywide organization to put in 50,000 as a start, and then they withdrew it, and the feeling was we would need several $100,000 to qualify here. It's tough in LA. It's tough to do an initiative.
I understand that.
Yeah. But if every neighborhood council decided to get on, and if this was a part of the next year, the neighborhood council elections, if City of LA does hold them, because now they're trying to debate not holding them because there isn't so much money, I would argue that they should hold them and make sure also there's a debate about whether the city clerk's office is going to give them up and give them back to the neighborhood councils to run. It used to be that way, and then it went to the clerk's office. When the clerk's office did it, the record keeping was good. If it goes back to the neighborhood councils, we really have to make sure that it's open and transparent. So, the point about from your city council elections, Bill Rosendahl did support it before. I think it makes sense here to go ahead and reaffirm to him that you think that that's an issue that shouldn't go away, that the council, they pretty much up until about the end of October of 2012 would be time to put it on the ballot in 2013. So I'll stop right there. Let's see if there's any questions on these various electoral reforms. But that's kind of an overview about, well, let me just say one more point about how proportional systems would work and how they can be there to grab a historic moment. After the eco-catastrophe in Japan, the Fukushima nuclear power plant, the tsunami, the earthquake, the whole thing, and the continuing catastrophe that's going there even today with radiation continuing to go. In Germany, they have proportional representation. And the Green Party has been elected on the federal level for all but 4 years since 1983, making it an identity because we've been anti-nuke all this time. So people clearly associate us with that. And when we were part of a coalition government running Germany from 1998 to 2005, there was a plan approved. It was us together with the Social Democratic Party there, which is the analog to the Democratic Party in Germany. Together we got a plan that would phase out the nuclear power plants by 2017, I think it was. Then the center-right government got in power. And they said, no, we're going to extend the life, we're going to extend the phase out for many, many more years. Then Fukushima happened. So what happened in the elections in Germany? They had several state elections there. including in some states where there are remaining nuclear power plants. The fear of the center-right governing party that they would lose votes to the Green Party caused them to change their policies and start to say that they were in favor of a phase-out. Not as strong as the Green Party, but they were in favor of a phase-out. In our country, during the same thing, our President Obama came out proposing $36 billion in loan guarantees for the nuclear power industry because it's uncompetitive in our free market capitalist system, even though they already get a subsidy with the Price-Anderson Act, which limits the amount that they would pay in the event of a nuclear disaster to only about 5% of the cost. We already subsidize them with that, but even still it can't compete. So now Obama, the alleged center-left representative on the federal level in this country, is shilling for the nuclear power industry after Fukushima, where in Germany, the center-right party is becoming anti-nuclear. What happened? The German Greens took over and are running and have the governor now of Baden-Württemberg, which was a conservative state that had conservative government for 62 years. And now the Green Party is running that state, and it also gained in several other states. So we're in a historic moment now, and this is my last point, but I just got to close on this. We're in a historic moment. I can feel you. I've done this for a long time, I know. But we're in a historic moment, and everybody's saying now to the Occupy movement, why don't you just do what the Tea Party did? Take over the Republican Party, take over the Democrats now. And just like that, and you'll get the change. The Tea Party movement faction was a faction of the Republican Party already, number one, and to some degree it was a rebranding of the Republican Party. But number two, we have to remember that they had a television network, Fox, doing their work continually since the 2008 election, and you've got the billionaire Koch brothers funding the effort all over the country. Nobody is doing that for the Wall Street movement. There's no TV network beating that drum every day, and there are no billionaires. George Soros hasn't stepped up, or Warren Buffett hasn't stepped up. We're lucky that we're getting donations to have some porta potties down in downtown LA, but it isn't like the Occupy movement is being funded and living in luxury. So it's harder in this winner-take-all system. If we had a proportional system, the Green Party in California, the Peace and Freedom Party, the Libertarians, a lot of other groups would be getting a lot more representation, and all of a sudden you'd be seeing Glass-Steagall, coming back in the Congress. You'd be seeing Bernie Sanders wouldn't be the only guy in the Senate arguing for some of these sort of things. So we have to remember that we have to also change the electoral system so that when the moment for change is there, the system can really incorporate and express that. Thanks.
So anyway, let's give one more round of applause. That was
Fairvote.org, best website for electoral reform in the U.S. What is it? Fairvote.org.
Fairvote.org.
And San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley all already have ranked choice voting. It's in California. There are a couple dozen other places around the country that have it, and it was actually the law in about 30 cities between the 20s and 50s. Cincinnati had it, Cleveland had it. Why was it gotten rid of? Too many socialists were getting elected, and too many African Americans were getting elected. And the powers that be thought, no, that's not acceptable. That's a little bit too much democracy. So different cities, there were campaigns, and ultimately they got rid of it, but it's coming back.
But this is
like, right, yes.
Stacking is another adage
Stacking.
where a facilitator or a co-facilitator actually takes notice of everyone's question. Is this realistic, though, to actually, can we do this?
Yes.
Serious.
Yeah, okay, is it realistic? And yes, it's realistic, but let me add one more variable about why it's right. Proportional representation systems compared to winner-take-all systems. Proportional representation systems overwhelmingly have the largest representation of women and have the largest diversity. Winner-take-all systems across the world have much less diversity and it's much more male-oriented. I mean, it's just country after country after country. So as far as is it possible and how we sell it. Now in California, where I see the best chance for it here is Schwarzenegger. One of the worst things he did to us in office, and he, probably the biggest thing he did to us is spent, how long was it, 7 years trying to rerun Reagan trickle-down economics and give us that BS argument here instead of dealing with the structural economic problems. So he cost us 7 years of opportunity and a lot of short-term, 1-year ways of trying to deal with the budget deficits. We lost 7 years because of him. So that was a terrible thing he did to us. But another thing he did is a ballot measure called Proposition 14, which passed in June of 2010, which eliminates party primaries entirely. And only 2 candidates can be on the general election ballot. And it gets rid of write-ins. So this is a crazy plan, and we can talk about it a lot, but since we've been talking for a long time, it's passed. This passed. And it's in court now. There's some challenges to it, and I think in the long run it's going to be declared unconstitutional. Hopefully before it really goes into effect in 2012. So when your question is, can we get this kind of structural electoral reform change? What I think is going to happen in the state is when Proposition 14 gets thrown out, and actually Michael Chamness here has been playing a critical role in one of the key lawsuits that's challenging the unconstitutionality of Prop 14, and he deserves a little, or even a big hand for that. Yeah. So let's assume that Prop 14 gets thrown out. Now in California, before Prop 14, we had what was called an open primary in 96, 98, and 2000, where, or maybe it was just 98 and 2000, where at that time everybody could vote in everybody else's primaries, but each party still had a candidate on the general election ballot. That got declared unconstitutional because of the free association rights of parties. Then they came back with this Proposition 14, which is even worse. But those are there because people are frustrated with the winner-take-all system for the reasons that we talked about before. And that frustration is not going to go away once Prop 14 is thrown out in the courts. So what happens then? When the day comes that Prop 14 is thrown out, then that's where we grab and say, look, we can't just change the headlights on the vehicle. We need to change the engine itself. And the engine of the democracy is whether it's a winner-take-all or proportional thing. I believe that we're most likely to get that kind of change through a constitutional convention rather than through the regular petitioning and initiative process. Why? If we have a constitutional convention, and we haven't had one since 1879, and we don't have a government that is appropriate for 21st century world society California, we don't. So if we had a constitutional convention, and it was a convention that was really made up of, like, the people of the state, what happens then? Then you're beta testing your ideas. So let's say that a convention like that came up with something, some sort of proportional representation system. Now you've tested it already. It hasn't just come from one special interest group, which is the way our initiatives usually come to the state, and then they come up with an idea, then they go out and raise the money, and then they convince other people to sign the petitions and campaign for it. Instead, if it came out of a group that was reflective of the entire state, now you have a better sense of what the people of the state would want, and what's likely to go ahead and pass. And how do you get a constitutional convention? And let's just close on this. The law of the state right now is that the legislature, by a 2/3 vote of the legislature, could put the question on the ballot for the people to say, yes, we want a convention or not. Since 1879, they did that once in 1932, and then after the people voted to have the convention, the legislature refused to fund it, and it didn't happen. So nothing has happened since then. I was part of a movement a couple of years ago to bring this power to the people directly so that the people could call a convention by the initiative process ourselves. That required an initiative that would give us that power, and we had 2 initiatives. One would give us that power, and then the second one was going to call a convention specifically to deal with the structural questions of our democracy and the structural deficit in our economic system. 2 deficits we have. We have a democratic deficit, and we have an economic deficit. So what happened is we drafted the ballot measure, we went to go ahead, we filed with the state, we were ready to get signatures, and what happened then? The signature gathering companies refused to work for us because they thought we would amend the initiative process and it could cut down the number of initiatives and thus cut down their business. And they told individual people they would blacklist them and they couldn't work for other initiatives if they went ahead and worked for ours. Okay? So, it's amazing but true. It's true, yeah.
I was involved.
It's unsaid. So, however, the next time around, That last one came really by chance because there's a group called the Bay Area Council in the Bay Area of the CEOs of the 75 largest corporations. Their CEO wrote an op-ed after the summer 2009 budget was late, which was year after year the budget was late, saying, look, things are so bad, we can't fund things, the government's dysfunctional, we need a constitutional convention. It was just an op-ed. Out of nowhere, people started writing and calling them saying, we're right, we want to be involved. And a few months later, in February of 2010, they held a big kind of broad forum in Sacramento. People from all over the state came and said, yeah, we want to do this. So they kind of got thrown into it without planning. They weren't a signature gathering. It's not like CalPERG, for example, that's done, or Common Cause that's done a lot of ballot measures. This was just a business group that, this wasn't their thing. So they ended up getting to the point of trying to develop the content and facilitating that process, and then getting signatures. Going to to draft it and trying to get the signatures really kind of last minute. They weren't prepared for it. The next time that Prop 14 comes down, that's the time to have an organized movement to activate the young people in this state whose education is being underfunded because of the economic issues and the democracy issues in the state, and I think we could qualify a convention in that way. And I'll just say the final piece about a convention. There were three models of who gets to be a delegate. Are they elected? Are they appointed? Or are they chosen in some process that is designed to draw randomly in a representative way from our population? I was part of the group that said it can't be elected or appointed because it's going to replicate the power structures of the people who are there now. But if we could draw it from the population, and there are models that can go through and draw from people who have indicated their willingness to serve, their willingness to really commit for 6 months, and then still do it in a way to and what we came up with was 6 people from each of the 80 assembly districts, because by law it still has to be from the assembly districts or the senate districts, and that would have given us a convention of 480 people. Then imagine, with all the modern technology, the feedback loops, to have people at home. Each day it's on the California channel. Now Myrtle from Clovis, is sitting there and, talking about this. These are called citizens' assemblies. British Columbia had one for their people, and they recommended proportional representation. Prince Edward Island in Canada, they had one. Ontario had one. They all come up with proportional representation. They all reject winner take all. South Africa, when it overthrew apartheid, they looked at the U.S. system and specifically rejected the U.S. system. And they had the mirror opposite image of white and black, but they wanted to look at, in terms of the population, the numbers. But they wanted to ensure that everybody would have a voice. And they saw how our system was excluding people's voice, and they said, we want to have everybody have a voice, and they went with a fully proportional system there. So,
question. You said that in an earlier effort to get the representational paradigm, that the powers that be sort of sabotage it. So what would prevent that from happening again and again and again?
that's why the question about whether the powers that be would sabotage it, the reason why I recommend a constitutional convention as the path to get there is that a convention that represents the people, and if you're watching on television, seeing people who look like you there, who are coming up like this, and who are from the diverse economic classes, and aren't just from the privileged and elite of the society, the economic elite, then it's more likely to pass. And people are more likely to connect to it.
Actually,
he had a question.
Well, go ahead, because yours is probably much more relevant to what's being said right now.
But 14 has to go before we can do this?
No. We could do it even if Prop 14 stays and just overturn 14 and pass something better in its place. But what I'm saying is the likelihood that if 14 is overthrown, the hunger for increased democracy, there's a lot of people who think Prop 14 together with redistricting is going to make a big difference. People that I associate with generally think it's not. But for the people who think it's going to make a difference, if that's taken away, they're going to be, okay, now we have to look somewhere else.
So, I just had a question. I appreciate the pragmatic approach. I'm wondering if you see value in Occupy Venice as
Yes.
being something that's much more inclusive in terms of
Yes.
it as being a place that's almost given this extraordinary movement of that's this spontaneous, leaderless movement that's much more rooted in mass injustice and larger scope issues on the federal level, on the Federal Reserve level, like much more sort of corruption at a large scale corruption. I'm wondering if you see value in Venice, Occupy Venice specifically, as being this inclusive place of ideas that's not necessarily specific, that doesn't pigeonhole itself to be about a specific reform locally, or a sort of narrowing itself to a point at which it's almost about reform and less about maybe some of the other principles
well, the reason that I focused on the electoral reform is that that's the piece that I think is spoken of much less. I think the articulation of the issues, the Occupy Wall Street statement is absolutely fantastic, and is a set of reforms that have, are perspectives and places where we need to look at change. But as somebody who has helped to co-found the Green Party in California, who has been part of a movement to try and make a multi-party democracy in our state and in our country for a couple of decades, I have gotten to see a couple chess steps ahead of where a lot of the occupiers haven't been yet. And that is, okay, once we have our demands, we're going to find out how unresponsive the system is to them, and therefore what's going to be necessary next. So I think it's important to hear these sort of things and to be looking ahead for them. It's going to be tough, Dennis Kucinich, for example. How many Democrats pay attention to him?
Sure.
Very few. And in 2004, the convention, they ended up, mocking him so much they removed single-payer health care from the platform, and he still had to stand up there and cheer for Kerry on the stage. So the difficulties in trying to advance alternative views are structurally inhibited by our electoral system. And that's why it's just, I think, so important to get this out there.